So let's take a look at how we can use the properties of arithmetic, multiplication and addition, to minimize the amount of basic facts, the number of basic facts that students need to memorize. As I mentioned, memory is one of our weakest skills and capabilities, because as soon as we get stressed out, as soon as we have some kind of pressure, memory is the first thing that goes. So if we want students to have to be efficient at calculating and multiplying or adding, we need to make sure that we give them strategies other than just basic fact memorization, so that they can retrieve those facts, those multiplication facts, even when they're under stress, or when they've forgotten something, when memory kind of fails them. So here's the multiplication table up through 9. Ones are easy. There's a pattern there. And tens are there's another strategy for that. So we won't include those in this table. But when they're multiplying single digits, there are some things that we clearly can eliminate so that they don't have to memorize those basic facts. So for example, if we look at the white area, now all of this white area, all of these basic facts like 8 times 3, or 9 times 3, or 6 times 2, they don't need to memorize if they remember the stuff in the basic facts in the orange. So 2 times 6 is 12. If they know that 2 times 6 is 12, and they know that multiplication is commutative, then they know that 6 times 2 is 12 as well. So knowing the lower left side of the multiplication table, they can kind of get this part for free. All right, so they don't need to memorize it. Now, let's take a look inside the orange. Now, the doubles is something that kids practice a lot, and they actually remember the doubles quite well. But even if they didn't, there are strategies. For example, for 2 times 7, there are strategies that they can use. Well, 2 groups of 7 or 7 groups of 2. Well, 2 groups of 7 is the same as 2 groups of 5 plus 2 groups of 2. And they know that 2 groups of 5 is 10. So double the 5, you get 10, and then double the 2, you get 4, and that's 14. So they don't actually need to memorize that 2 times 7 is 14. Most of them do anyway, just by repetition or by visualizing. They use base 10 frames, and they would have seen 7 represented a few million times. So they'll see that there's 5 and 2. 7 is 5 and 2. That's something they visualize quite easily. And if you double that, you would get the 2 5s, 10 and 4. So those doubles are generally quite easy for students to remember. And generally the multiplying of those is not a problem. Now, when we get to triples, let's say 3 times 4 is 12. How do we figure those out? Well, they can do a few things. They could say, well, 2 times 4 is 8. 2 groups of 4 is 8, plus another 4 is 12. Or they might know that 3 times 3 is 3 groups of 3 is 9. Okay, that's one of those visual numbers, very visual numbers. 3 groups of 3 is 9. And they can say plus another group of 3 is 12. Right? So there's lots of ways that they can come up with 3 times 4. 3 times 5 they can as well. Now, these numbers in the beige, in the light beige rectangle, are much harder to memorize. So, for example, 4 times 7. And I can tell you that for me, that's one of the first number facts that actually goes when I am under stress. So I very rarely actually say 4 times 7 and try to remember what it is, recall what it is. I often just say that's 2 times 2 times 7, so 2 times 14, 28. Right? So in fact, I don't even usually verbalize this. I just say 4 times 7 is 2 times 14, which is 28. So we don't need to commit that to memory. as much as just as a recall. 3 times 6, you can think of different ways that you could do that. Maybe 2 times 6, right? 2 groups of 6 is 12, plus another 6 is 18. 2 with 3 times 7. Some kids will say, well, it's let's do 3 groups of 5 and 3 more groups of 2. So 3 groups of 5 they know is 15, and 3 more groups of 2 is 6 more. Lots and lots of different strategies for this. So all of these numbers, all of these basic facts can actually be efficiently and effectively and accurately calculated by a strategy from other facts. So this one is my favorite one, the 6 times 7, because I have spoken with mathematicians and I have conceded that I do not remember what 6 times 7 is. I never use basic recall for 6 times 7. I always say that that's 2 times 21. And notice what happens there in my mind is instead of 6 times 7, I write the 6 as a 2 times 3. So then that becomes 2 times 21 is 42. Right? The funny thing with 6 times 8 is also that I don't usually just recall that fact. In fact, what I do is I have to say that in Russian. 6,848, because it rhymes. Well, the problem is that times 8, 48 is going to rhyme in any language, and in fact it rhymes in English. 6 times 8 is 48. But for some reason, the way my mind works, especially under stress, is that for that particular calculation, I switch back to Russian. Is that something that I would recommend for everybody? No, but it's certainly something that you can, that individually I've come to use. All right, so let's take a look at what the questions are that they would like us to actually specifically address. So examine the darkly colored, lightly colored, and uncolored regions above multiplication table. Explain how to obtain them. Uncolored facts quickly and easily from the shaded facts, and what property do you use? So we established that this was going to be with a commutative property. And how does knowing this property arithmetic lighten the load of students learning single-digit multiplication facts, right? So that's, in fact, it's cutting it in half. If you know the bottom left half, you will automatically, as a bonus, get the top right half. So with 6, 7, and 8, they're often hard to learn, and we just talked about those briefly. And so here are a couple of examples. So if we have 3 times 7, right, some of the kids might say 3 times 7 is 3 groups of 7 is 2 groups of 7 plus another group. So they know 2 groups of 7 is 14 plus 7 is 21. Or they might say that it's 3 groups of 3 and another 3 groups of 4. Right? So 3 groups of 3 they know is 9 and plus 12 is 21. So there are lots of different strategies that can be used, and this particular one is a distributive strategy where you take the full array and you calculate parts of it and then add the sum, add the total up. There are other ways that you can use some strategies to simplify some of the facts. So for example, the 5s table. 5 table is simply half of the 10 table. The 10 multiplication is really easy, right? We move the digit to the left on the place value. So 10 times 2 is 20, 10 times 6 is 60. But then those numbers are actually fairly easy to divide by 2. So if you don't want 10 times 5, but you want 5 times 5, we're going to take half of 50, and that's 25. Or if you want 5 by 8, we can do 10 by 8 and divide by 2, so that's 40. So there's another really nice strategy that helps kids remember the 5 times. Right? Now the 9 times, we can use the distributive, and we actually had an example like this earlier. Well, if you want 9 times 6, right? You could do 10 groups of 6, but then you overcounted by a group. So you would subtract one of those groups. So you would do 10 groups of 6. There's your 60. And subtract the one group of 6. Subtract 6. So you get 9 groups of 6. And the same thing would be a good strategy for, say, any 9 times. There is 9 times 8, so 9 groups of 8 is 10 groups of 8 minus a 1 group of 8. So 72. So there are other patterns for multiplying by 9, and those you may know the finger trick, the hands trick. You may know other patterns, but so for example, the sum, right? The sum is 9, always 9. So there are lots of other patterns that kids can use, but I think that the idea of groups, interpreting it as groups, is the most connected one to what's actually happening with a base 10 blocks and with the numbers. All right, so what I would like you to do is take, we all have basic facts that are our least favorite, that are the hardest ones for us. So what I would like you to do is take some time and take a piece of paper, write down the basic multiplication facts that are your least favorite, the ones that you mess up more and are harder to retrieve, and then see if you can create a strategy for those from from basic facts that are easy to retrieve for you. And that may be different for everybody. So good luck, and let me know on Monday which ones you did.